Start by introducing myself. Last week, I didn't introduce myself until the very end of the presentation. Always great protocol for a webinar. My name is Guy Greenaway. I'm Senior Project Manager at the Moustakas Institute, and I'm glad that you guys have all been able to join us for this Moustakas Monday webinars. I'll just tell you a little bit quickly why we're doing these webinars. The obvious piece, just we're all stuck at home, or most of us are stuck at home, and keeping connected and keeping on top of what's going on in conservation is going to be a challenge as we go forward. And so Moustakas thought this might be helpful to present some of these webinars as we go along. We're letting people know about the webinars through our newsletter, our newsletter list. Those are people that we've gotten permission to send out information to. And so the best way to find out about the link for each of the next webinars is to get that through the newsletter. You can get that straight off of our website, rockies.ca. But with the newsletter, we'll send out on Thursdays a notice about the next webinar and a link to that next webinar, and you can get signed up that way. Okay, without any further ado, we'll get started on today's webinar. So I'll start with just a very quick description of the Moustakas Institute for those of you who are not familiar with us. We are a not-for-profit organization. We're a registered charity, and fundamentally our most important role is an applied research institute. We're affiliated with Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta. Our vision statement is a world where communities have genuine access to the science and research they need to make the choices that promote healthy landscapes. And the way we do that, our mission statement, the work that we do, is to make innovative research accessible to communities and decision makers. And I always note that decision makers, we mean everyone from municipal governments, federal governments, provincial governments, industry players, other NGOs, individual landowners, anybody who's making a decision that has an impact on the ecological health of the landscape. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by telling you about this project that sits over top of the topic for today, the Regional Wetlands Data Strategy, just to give you a little context. And then I'm going to dive into the two main meat pieces of the presentation. First, the wetlands data sets in use in Alberta and the municipal wetlands data issues and needs. So it will become more clear when I give you a description about the project, why we zeroed in on those things. But I just want to note a couple of people. Ken Sanderson at Moustakas was the lead in putting together the data catalog, and Holly Kinnis at Moustakas was the lead in putting together the municipal survey. So my thanks to both of them. So like I said, a little bit of background information here. The Regional Wetlands Data Strategy project, I apologize for this, this little bit wordy slide, but I'll go through it. Why did we want to do this project? Well, it was a recognition of a couple of things that I think everyone on the line is familiar with. The importance of wetlands, continuing loss of wetlands, efforts to try and restore wetlands, and municipal decision-making that have impacts. All of that is happening while municipalities in Southern Alberta, and we focused on Southern Alberta, but this applies to all municipalities, we believe don't have good access to wetlands data that serves their planning and their decision-making needs. And so to dive into that a little bit more deeply, it's not the case that wetlands data do not exist in our focus area, the Bow River Basin, but that when a municipality comes to use that wetlands data, the mix of standards and accuracy, lack of awareness of what is available, all of these things, plus some other factors, lead to a low level of usability of that data for wetlands conservation and a low level of trust in the data itself. So that was the background of the project. The project itself was these 4 points. Surveying and interviewing to determine municipal wetland data needs, and we've completed that. Cataloging the available wetlands data sets and information sources that are accessible by municipalities, we've completed that. And in the middle of February, I believe February 13th, we convened a municipal wetlands data needs workshop. And we had about 30 people representing 12 different municipalities in the Bow River Basin, as well as the Bow River Basin Council and the Oldman River Regional Services Commission, because there's some overlap there as well. So a number of people that we wanted to gather to be involved in this project, present all of that information to, but then this last point, the most important part, seeing if we can help develop a recommended wetlands data strategy for Southern Alberta municipalities, and that's what we're currently working on. But what I'm going to present to you today is those first 2 bullets, the work that we did in the background, that we provided to the participants at the at the municipal wetlands workshop, and then some of the changes that happened as a result of the feedback that we got from those municipalities. So starting with the wetland data sets that are in use in Alberta, just a little bit of context. Again, I think probably most of you are aware of this, but a lot of the descriptions make reference to the green area and the white area, just to be clear for everybody. The green area represented on that map, helpfully in green, it's about 58% of the province. It includes most of northern Alberta and that strip of mountain and foothill areas along the province's western border. And the white area, or sometimes called the settled area, other 42% of the province, the primarily the populated area in the southern, so in the parkland, in the prairie, and also in the peace areas of the province. And I think it's important to note that last point, that about 75% of that land is privately owned. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each one of these data sets and give you a very quick snapshot of each one of them. Like I said, this was presented to the participants at the workshop to provide this context. And that blob that you see, that sort of round amorphous blob, that's a rough clip of the Bow River Basin. There wasn't a really solid data-based way to clip that. We looked for a number of different ways. So it wasn't really important that we get a clear delineation. We just wanted to have a rough delineation. So if you think of that as being the entire Bow River Basin from the west to the east. So the coverage here for the first one that we're going to talk about, the ABMI wetland inventory, is the green area. So that means the west side of the Bow River watershed would be covered. The classes that were in there are open water, fen, bog, marsh, swamp, general wetland. And we wanted everybody to understand how classes were represented in each one of these data sets. We didn't go into a detailed discussion about that, and I can talk about that more in detail later. The last update, June 2019, so it's a very recent data set. Some of the notes that Ken added here were, there's a class wetland general wetland. It's wetlands that are not fen, bog, marsh, or swamp, and it's specific to the Rocky Mountain area, so they created that component. And that it's intended to be used in combination with the Alberta Merged Wetland Inventory, the AMWI, for better overall coverage, because the merged wetland inventory is the white area only. So the next one that we presented was the Alberta Wetland Relative Value Evaluation Tool data set. Say that 5 times fast. Its coverage is the white area, and its classes are the relative wetland value categories, A, B, C, and D. And so these are derived from the wetland policy around the mitigation hierarchy largely. Won't go into a lot of detail, nor did we go into a lot of detail about the classes at the workshop. But I think a really important component to understand is this is not like your grade school grades. A D is not a fail and a C average. It's all of these have value. So that means that if you were to remove a D-valued wetland, you would have to replace it at a 1-to-1 ratio. So don't consider these things to, like I said, be representative like what we would expect on our social studies paper. All of these are valuable, but there are some that are at a higher level of value due to the number of functions that they provide. And again, all of that detail that Ken notes here is in the detailed report for that, and gives you more information. The last update for that was June 2015. It's important to understand that this data is summarized by the section. So that means that the hectares of each class per section. So when you come to trying to do more site-specific planning, this data set is challenging because it doesn't provide you information at that finer level, but gives you this larger scale picture. So it's good for larger scale evaluations, larger scale pictures, but not necessarily the more specific. The source data is more specific, and it's linked to the individual wetlands within the Alberta Merged Wetland Inventory, but we weren't able to access that information from the Government of Alberta. So I keep talking about it. Here it is, the Alberta Merged Wetland Inventory. Again, the coverage area is the white area. The classes, open water, fen, marsh, swamp. The last update was 2017, and as noted there, Update is a word that's to be taken in context because it's a merged inventory. It's a number of different data sets. So some of those data sets may have been updated very recently, some of them quite some time ago. And as that next point says, they vary quite a bit in detail and accuracy. So you may have one data set that's quite new but very low resolution, and another data set representing an area right beside it that's very high resolution but is much older. So the data set we understand is being considered for a revamp to allow more detail, but I'm not exactly sure how that is going to play out. And obviously, all things are going to play out differently right now, given our current situation. So the Canadian Wetland Inventory, maintained and created by Ducks Unlimited Canada. Again, our little blob is superimposed over top of the output representations from that data set. So it's partial coverage of the Bow River Basin. And in the interface that they have online, you can see which of the areas have been included already for coverage and which ones are yet to be included. Their classes are bog, fen, marsh, swamp, and shallow and open water. And again, last update, 2006 to 2017 again, because it varies depending on the specific area within the basin. And Ken noted that there's some extra information included as well in this data set, including whether or not it's impacted. Okay, so this next three, take a look at that bottom left box because we're going to do some basic math here. So the City of Calgary and Rocky View County have a wetlands data set. The coverage is the City of Calgary, Rocky View County, a chunk of Wheatland County, the western third and the northern tip of Foothills County. So the classes here are dugout, headland, marsh, marsh worked, and open water. And this is all based on 2005 data. So when I say this is the current picture, keep in mind that's current as of 2005. That current inventory was photography, flown in 2005, and the classes that they were looking at there were emergent vegetation, open water, and crop basin. So this information, the 2005 data, is used as the current reference point for the impact wetland inventory. So this next data set, my math with the plus historic. This is City of Calgary, Rocky View County historic wetland inventory, same coverage area, same classes, but this is based on 1962 and 67 data, again, photography, derived from photography that was flown in those 2 years, depending on the area within that whole coverage area. The classes are the same, and now this is used as the historic reference point for the impact wetland inventory. So our math equals current plus historic is how you get the picture of the impact, or the drained wetland inventory is sometimes how it's referred to. Again, it's the City of Calgary, Rocky View County, same coverage, same classes, except now the classes have drained, altered, drained, consolidated, drained, lost. So what this does now is give the ability to characterize the abundance, distribution, and state of the wetlands. There's some geoprocessing involved in there to create that. And so the model compares the historic and the current wetland features and then assigns an impact category based on those changes. And those changes are presence, absence, whether it's there and gone later on, or the presence, absence of drainage infrastructure. So those three data sets sort of constitute one data set. Other data sets are initiatives that exist across the basin that we wanted to point out. Things like Wheatland County did a complete inventory of their wetlands in 2016. Ducks Unlimited Canada has various data sets of different types, including the engineered wetlands, the Western Canada Wetland Data Inventory that was done in 2009. Rocky View County and the town of Cochrane collaborated on creating a wetland inventory for Cochrane and a portion of Rocky View that was completed in 2011. And then the town of Cochrane did an inventory for a particular neighborhood in Cochrane in 2009. And City of Calgary had Fiera Biological Consulting do a wetland inventory for them in 2015. So what we were trying to present in the workshop is all of the different data sets that might be accessible or might be available to municipalities based on our experience and the surveying that we did with the municipalities to find out what they're using. It's not intended to suggest that there isn't another data set. I think it's really important to understand that there are a number of smaller scale micro data sets, newer data sets for specific areas and especially for specific developments. But that's of course one of the core issues that we were talking about as well. So the next thing that we did was move into talking about the municipal wetlands data issues and needs. And I really have to emphasize that this is not a survey that was done with an intent to create a statistically valid, population weighted or area weighted, or this was a scan. This was to try and inform that workshop and inform that strategy development with all of the municipalities involved there, to come up with an understanding of what are some of the issues, and more importantly, what are some of the needs if we were to try and do something like this moving forward. So what we did was we undertook that research, and then we provided this back to the municipalities at the workshop. So the pre-workshop survey, this kind of repeats some of what I just said. It's a current situation, awareness of, current use of, and the existing wetlands data that are being used. So we wanted to know from the different municipalities, what was the situation within their municipality. What we did with each municipality was have them self-identify who was the best person to answer these questions, because of course in every municipality is quite different. Who would be the person who would be best positioned to answer some of these questions, or people who would be best positioned to answer this. In some cases, municipalities had a number of people gathered together to answer the questions. Then we asked them what the biggest challenges with and the primary needs were for existing wetlands data. And again, it's important to understand we're zeroed in on data. So there are a number of components around the wetland conservation questions, the wetland management issues in general, that are not data. They're around policy, they're around planning, they're around engagement. What we wanted to zero in on was the data question and see if we could help answer that particular point, because we feel it underlies a number of those other things. And we also feel that there's an assumption that the data is very, very solid, and that assumption may not in fact be valid in a lot of cases. So we did this last year between October and December, and had 15 responses from municipalities. So again, when you look at this data, make sure that you're not thinking of this in a very stratified way, that this represents every single municipality answering in every single question, in the sense of them being representative, like I said, of different ways we could have weighted it to population, to area. These are the municipalities who replied. I won't go through that list. Like I said, the presentation and the slides from the presentation will be available for everybody afterwards. But what I think is interesting is to get a sense of the characterization of the people who responded. So we had a good mix from town, county and MD and city people, and some other people. Like I said, we had planning commissions and Bow River Basin Council involved. Mostly it was planning staff members or managers, followed by the conservation or parks or environment personnel who was responding. Jumping down, a handful of GIS staff member or managers. No Councillor Mayor Reeves, no CAOs responding. Although we had contacted a number of those people, again, they would pass this on to the person that they felt was most suited to answer. So what I think is interesting and important to understand too is that that other category involved a lot of people saying kind of all of the above. Within municipalities that have lower capacity, that planning staff member is also in charge of parks and maybe even takes on orchestrating some of the GIS work within their municipality, or coordinating with the consultants they might work with. So there isn't clear divisions, obviously, between all of these people. In terms of the wetlands data use, what we wanted to look at was what you have heard of and used, that's the sort of bluer line at the top, and what you have just heard of, but not necessarily used. So at the top of the heard of and used list was the Alberta Merged Wetland Inventory. The drained wetland inventory, about 50-50, but again, remember that is specific to City of Calgary, Rocky View County, and chunks of the other rural municipalities nearby. ABMI wetland inventory is interesting. A low level of use relative to the high level of awareness, but I think that was due largely to ABMI putting a big marketing push on that data set around the same time that we were doing this survey. So everybody sort of had an email message in their inbox to tell them about that. And then similarly, the Ducks Unlimited wetlands data, there was a high level of awareness of that data and a relatively low level of use of that data. The next question we asked them was, in your municipality, how do you use wetlands data? What purposes do you put it to? And pretty much everybody said it's part of our development review process, and that was no surprise. About 60% saying it's part of our environment or conservation planning, so the proactive part of that. A little under half saying it's part of our stormwater management strategy. And then about a fifth saying that it was to identify opportunities for wetland restoration. I think that's probably on an upward trend, but still relatively low. And then a few people saying it's part of an offsetting or in lieu payment program, and usually part of the wetland policy and the payment part of the wetland mitigation hierarchy and the response to the wetland mitigation hierarchy. There were a few that were coming in using the information to inform those kinds of programs. So where do you get your wetlands data from? 73% said it came from the provincial government. 60% said from a development proponent or their consultant. And of course, again, we've got overlap. It may be that their consultant is gathering information from the provincial government as well, but that was the primary vector or the most proximate vector they received the information from. A little over half saying directly from an environmental consultant, so someone that they specifically as a municipality hired as opposed to a development proponent hiring a consultant. About a third saying from reconnaissance and ground truthing. So again, probably in combination with other types of data collection, but going out and actually walking that and doing the ground truthing. A little over a quarter saying from NGOs, and that's primarily going to be Ducks Unlimited Canada, obviously. About a fifth saying an inventory we developed ourselves. And again, I think a lot of those inventories, there are a couple of municipalities who have done inventories across their entire municipality, and a couple who have done inventories specific to an area structure plan or a particular portion of the municipality. The next question we asked them was, how do you update your wetlands data? And 3/4, again, relatively unsurprisingly, saying we have no set mechanism for updating our data. Half saying when the government of Alberta updates their data, then we get updated data. About a fifth saying when a development proponent provides it to us or when an NGO provides it to us. A little over 6% saying when funding allows. And I think you can tie those ones to the ones who are proactively trying to do inventories within their municipality that they self-fund. So when funding is available, they can update that. This was an interesting one to me, the far right, 0% saying when we update our relevant policies. So really no connection between policy and data in terms of needing to update data or feeling the need to update data or the ability to update data when relevant policies are updated or changed. The next question we asked them was around the wetland resources, and I've shortened this here to call it wetland resources, but basically what we're saying are, what are the things that you have within your municipality that can support you to get data, that can support you to protect wetlands, that can support you to develop your wetland management approach. So 85% saying our MDP references the importance of wetlands. About a third saying we have wetlands that we have protected in some way directly by some mechanism. Just under a third saying that we have a wetland policy, a municipally specific wetland policy. Just over a fifth saying that we have restored wetlands in our municipality. About 14% saying we've constructed wetlands in our municipality. Again, remember, this is percentages of respondents and not necessarily percentages of the municipalities. This is just giving us a scan. Again, about 14% saying that they have a municipal wetlands inventory of their own. So the next area that we asked them about was issues around wetlands data. The first thing saying, what are the biggest challenges with wetlands data that you have? And these kind of grouped after we did a weighted average. So the top two were it's too expensive to gather, it's too expensive to update, and or it's outdated. So those were the top ones. Then there was a group that kind of collected in the middle. The data fields don't serve our purposes, so that data set is there, but the fields within that data set are not something that are relevant to the kinds of decisions we're making. We have limited capacity, so that might be computer capacity as in processing capacity, or limited personnel, limited knowledge. That's even just the people within the municipality who'd be able to quarterback any of these initiatives, and then just being unclear what data is available. So those all sort of group together. Next was the category that was a classification system not really working for our needs. And for those who are not familiar with the situation in Southern Alberta municipalities, a number of them have policies that they have developed over the years that make reference to a now unused classification system from the provincial perspective called the Stewart and Cantrud system, where you might have seen class 1, 2, 3 wetlands. So that classification was superseded by when the whole process of creating the new wetland policy, a new Alberta wetland classification system that doesn't use those categories. So they're referencing here the situation where they have policies that refer to a different classification system. And then down towards the, or sorry, and grouped in with about that same level as well was the resolution is due course for our purposes. So yes, there is data, it covers our area, but it doesn't really cover it in fine enough resolution that the kinds of decisions we make are supported by that data. And then the last one was it doesn't cover our area, but that again came in at a relatively low level. So some additions that happened at the workshop, and it's important to understand that when we got these 30 people or so together at the workshop from 12 different municipalities, we didn't do this in any sort of consensus building or weighting of the answers. We were just looking for verification of what we put forward. And for the most part, there wasn't a lot of changes. It was, yes, what has come up and the relative weightings of what has come up makes sense to us. There wasn't a lot of change there. But then we pressed people and said, well, what additions would you make to this issues list? Now, this issues list, it may be just one person saying this is an issue for me and nobody else feels that way. We didn't ask for consensus. So take this list in that context, that it's just a brainstorming list. So some of the things that came up were, again, under the context of issues around wetlands data, roles and responsibilities of the municipalities, developers' tools for land development, wetland loss that support conservation. There are issues around the availability and the use of those, timing of the data availability. So in many cases where the data becomes available after a proponent has come forward with something, not before. This next one, can't avoid with no data, referencing the wetland policy and the wetland mitigation hierarchy, where you're supposed to avoid, but if you don't have data, that's hard to do. A number of comments came up and we sort of gathered them in a couple of these comments around environmental reserve. So environmental reserve can be a wetland, but an intermittent or ephemeral wetlands, the classes of those wetlands relative to environmental reserves, and then the next point over on the other column, mapping wetlands you think are crown versus environmental reserve. So what was being referenced there was just this challenge of trying to reconcile what you're doing with environmental reserve with your wetlands data and your wetlands information. The next two are around benefits, so can't quantify the benefits, a challenge in trying to do that, and the need to value those benefits when you're trying to make a case, which relates to the next one, making the case, getting council buy-in. There may be people in the room who are saying, yes, I understand this, but it's challenging for my council, or it's challenging for my community to buy into this. Information integration across municipal departments. Again, some have too many departments, some have too few departments, depending on your capacity, but it's still a challenge trying to integrate across those departments. The need to use familiar tools. So sometimes new things arise that they just don't have the ability to go and learn and incorporate, or maybe they're already set in using a particular tool, so the need to use familiar tools. This one came up a lot, the purpose-driven creation of data. So the data needs to be created with a particular purpose, the decision-making purpose in mind, as opposed to create the data and then look around and see what purpose it can be used for. The logistics, this was a key one, of course, that if you were to create this data, how do you store it? Where is it stored? Who's responsible for that? Related to the next one, who's responsible for updating it and how do you support that updating? All of this needing to be contained within a longer term data strategy. Again, references to the capacity capacity on data management, capacity on processing, and the potential ramifications for what that would mean for municipalities. Do you need to hire specialized personnel? Another point was made that the data and the expertise tends to, within this existing model, circulate back to consultants as opposed to the municipalities, and that's a challenge for them in trying to make their decisions. And then there are other implications behind that data, so it's not just the conservation implications, but what what are you peeling back when you start to come up with more detailed data? Okay, the next thing I'm going to move into is the needs. So this was the more important piece in a lot of ways. We're trying to understand the issues so that that could inform a better discussion around the needs, because as I mentioned at the beginning, all of this is to try and create a collective strategy that municipalities can take forward to try and more collaboratively address those issues. Well, what are the needs that you have? Why would you want to have wetlands data? So at the very top of the list, the needs or the characteristics of that wetland data that they were looking for specifically. Again, these are weighted averages from the far left being unimportant to the far right being critical, to support our site-specific planning, and to just show size, dimensions, and boundaries. So anecdotally, we had heard in advance that there were a number of municipalities who were simply using Google Maps to understand where their municipalities were, because they felt that that was the most defensible representation of their wetlands. They're identifying in this that they would love to have something more robust than that. The next grouping is showing connectivity with other wetlands and sorry, it's cut off there, but other areas within the basin, informing wetland protection actions, including wetland class designations. So again, we've got this inconsistency with designations, having that information clarified and included in the data, providing ecological information, so not just the specifics of how big and where and all of that, but the ecological information around habitat and a number of other aspects around ecology that will relate to climate change and changes and that sort of thing, and being standardized with other municipalities in the basin. There's a recognition that they know that there are differences across the boundaries, differences that are frustrating for developers, frustrating for landowners, frustrating for planners, and those inconsistencies are something that everybody was aware of. And showing water volumes. This is coming up more and more in the context of natural infrastructure and the value of wetlands for, especially for stormwater capture and so for flood mitigation. But I think increasingly we're going to see that for hopefully recognition of its value for drought mitigation as well. So then the next batch is that data needs to be specific to the kinds of wetlands in our region. It needs to inform wetland restoration choices. It needs to help clarify this ongoing challenge with identifying, understanding, and developing policy around ephemerals, showing where wetlands used to exist, again, that increasing focus on restoration. And then very noticeably lower than the rest was providing dollar values, but I have a note about that coming up as well. So again, we turned this over to everybody at the workshop and said, okay, let's walk through this. We talked through all of them. For the most part, there was agreement with both the items that were there and the weightings that were put on those. And again, we asked for additions at the workshop, but this time we did ask for a little bit of stratification. So what we said was, the way we looked at the data before, it kind of grouped into thirds. There was a couple that were in the top third, a couple that were in the middle third, a couple that were in the bottom third. Can we sort of do that today in the workshop? And what we did was say, put 2 asterisks next to the things that should be in the top third, 1 asterisk for what should be in the middle third, and then no asterisks for what should be in the bottom third. Now, again, not to say that's unimportant, just when you're prioritizing where that should be. There was only a couple that were additions that they felt should be elevated to that sort of top third or even middle third level. So the needs, user-friendly, understanding, consistent expertise, like all of that. How do you make it so that we can access it? How do you make it in the language that we speak? How do you make it accessible to us in the forums that we're already part of? The only one that got the 2 asterisks was more emphasis on drained wetlands, more emphasis on the restorable wetlands, the areas where we can focus our restoration activities. Support for wetland banking, more emphasis on dollar valuation. So that was one thing I noted when I was showing you that that chart before, that the dollar value one was quite low. When they revisited that, that was one where they said, no, that's, you know, it's not top of our list, but we need to bump that one up. Another one was stormwater management. And again, not that we need to use wetlands to dump all of our stormwater into, but we need to make sure that when we are gathering data around wetlands to try and inform our conservation activities, that that is integrated with our stormwater management system and data and priorities so that we can understand those two in concert. Other things that came up were licensing implementation, a suggestion to separate data around wetland retention and wetland conservation from other aspects, information, education, especially for private property wetlands, making sure people understand what the current laws are, what the current abilities are, especially for the rural municipalities. They emphasize that one quite strongly. Reducing costs for landowners and municipalities. This is a need with the data, but it was also discussed as this is a benefit of the data, that once you have this data in place, you're not sending individual landowners to go and find an environmental consultant just to identify where the wetlands are on your property, if we have that information in place in the beginning. And then this last one, talking again about the correlation between different wetland classes. We have this new wetland class system within the province. That's great. How does it crosswalk more comprehensively to the existing, or I shouldn't say existing, to the old system, the Stewart and Cantreed system that, like I said, exists in a lot of policies within Southern Alberta. Last couple of things, developing buffer and guidelines. And I think a lot of you who are familiar with the wetlands data world will identify in a number of cases, some of these things do exist, but maybe they don't exist in the right form, or maybe it's just simply a lack of awareness. And then another thing was water chemistry. This came up towards the end of the workshop. I think there might have been a little bit more discussion if we'd had a little bit more time, but the question of phosphorus, algal blooms, the connections to land use between, or the connections for wetlands between water chemistry and the land use activities around. So having more information reflected in the data around those things. So I'm going to finish off there. I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, our thanks to the Water Innovation Program at Alberta Innovates. They were the ones who provided us the grant, made us able to do this work. And I mentioned to you that all of these reports are available. So this website, the Wetland Data Workshop.ca, we created it just to share the information in advance of the workshop, but it ended up being a great way to share the information back. It's open and available to everybody. And what you'll find there is information about the workshop, so the agenda and that sort of thing. These background reports on the data issues and needs and on the data catalog, a meeting record of the actual workshop. And what we'll be doing is, as we create pieces from the rest of this project, we'll be putting that up onto that website and making that available to people as well. The last thing I'll leave you with is my contact information. So first thing, if you would like a copy of the slides, please email me at that email address and I'd be happy to send you a copy of the slides. And secondly, that is my phone number. Please don't use it because none of us are at the office. Right now we're all working from home, like many of you. For the foreseeable future, there'll just be a message there to tell you to look for email addresses or go to the website. But that's all of the information that I was going to present. I'm going to move over to the questions. I know there were a couple of questions that were noted in the chat box, but please turn to your chat box. And if anybody's having trouble with the chat box, again, if you go to the navigation bar in your computer, in the Zoom app on your computer, it's going to look a little different for different people depending on the kind of computer you're on. You will see in there an ability to open up the chat box if it's not already there. Make sure that you're able to see all of the other chat pieces that are in there. There's a number of comments and questions that have been posted already, but that's your mechanism for providing information, or sort of providing your questions to me. So the questions that came forward were, I'm going to group these, was Rocky View County represented, and did the MD of Bighorn participate, yes, there was representation from both of those municipalities. And while I'm waiting for people to find other questions, I'm just going to put that back up as well and make sure that everybody had that workshop, or the website for the workshop, website for all of the information. So Peter's asking, did you interview or include agricultural staff in the study? They're the ones that typically deliver stewardship programs at the county level. So when you say agricultural staff, I'm assuming the ag fieldmen, the ag staff, definitely. Like I said, when you're in different municipalities, different types of municipalities, it's just as Peter mentioned, it's different roles that would take this on. And so, yes, we definitely included them. How do you envision dealing with the different wetlands classification categories over time? That is an excellent question. It's one of the things that we're digging into right now. Like I said, part of this project is, what I've presented to you was just the information from the background. That's what I thought we would put together for this webinar. The larger project includes a group sitting down to look at exactly some of those things. Now, one of the things that we're looking at is how do you gather information about the wetlands in a way that is usable by the municipality? So what we're going to try and do is start from the municipal planning, conservation decision-making needs and work backwards, as opposed to start from a data set and work forwards and try and reclass things to work. In that mechanism, we will come up against the classification situation. Right now, there are already, I should note, that the government of Alberta has put out some preliminary ways to be able to crosswalk that and to understand what the different categories might mean. So it's not that there isn't any crosswalking, but again, it's a question of scale for municipalities. Hi Guy, great background document. Thank you, Mary Ellen. Could you describe what's coming up next in the project? Well, glad you asked that, Mary Ellen. So one of the things that we're trying to do is not work in isolation. So we've been working with all of these municipalities, and I mentioned that we had the Bow River Basin Council. We reached out to the Old Man River Regional Services Commission, who does a lot of work for a number of municipalities all through Southern Alberta, to have them involved as well. And I'm hoping that we will be able to connect with the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, because the work that they've been doing, I think, is very instructional for us to understand in the Bow River Basin. So part of what's next, or all of what's next, is creating a strategy for municipalities to collaboratively propose a way that they would get data that is, we identified sort of 4 broad categories, but it essentially boils down to usable, accessible, replicatable data that is available to municipalities in a way that municipalities use it and is consistent across the municipalities in the basin. That is not a small ask, for sure. And one of the big questions there is, how do you fund doing something like that? So we're trying to come up with a mix of what's a methodology that works, that would be cost effective, that would be replicatable, that is comparable to what you guys are doing in North Saskatchewan Watershed, that is comparable to what the provincial government is doing with their work in their updating wetland data standards and those kinds of initiatives, as well as the ongoing work with the policy. So I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. Obviously, I don't want to presume what that will look like, but what we know is right now we're doing a small group that is an advisory group to help draft or kind of frame what that proposed strategy would look like, almost like listing the questions, and then get back to a larger group to present that and say, does this sound like a viable approach? That'll obviously include approaching the provincial government, including help for municipalities to approach their council and their community internally, if that's what's required. Do the municipalities have a way to share the wetland data gathered on municipal lands with each other? Example, wetlands consulting from construction projects. You've, in a roundabout way, already answered this as a future objective. That's a question from Ty. Yeah, it's a great question, because this is exactly a key fundamental issue. Is we have, and I'm totally going to oversimplify this, but we essentially have generic information across a large area, and then higher quality, more specific, higher resolution data in very small areas. It's usually gathered because of a particular initiative within a municipality, or a proponent has come forward for a development proposal and is asked to come up with more detailed wetlands information in that area. And all of those bits and pieces are gathered in different ways and collected in different places. So part of this collective strategy has to be, okay, if you were to collectively create this information, what is the updating mechanism for that? Where does it go? How does it go? Are you all collecting it in the same way? Are you giving the same instructions to your proponents? Information that is accessible to the consultants that are working in that area in a consistent way? And obviously, it's goes back the other direction as well. A lot of the expertise, as was noted, doesn't exist within the municipalities. It exists within those consultant groups as well. So yes, Tyne, that is definitely a future objective. I'm going to ask you guys a question, something that I've come across. We've all, and it's a broader question about these webinars. I've made available, I'll send out the slide deck to everybody, but I'm wondering if you think there is value in us putting up the recording of the webinar anywhere that can be grabbed and circulated by other people. We're working our way through this. This is only the second Moustakas Monday webinar, so just a thought, and you can even just email me later if you prefer to for that. Yes to recording. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah, and good idea on LinkedIn. That's the other thing we're trying to do, is figure out the best way to make things available. I'm sure all of you have seen all of the newscasts about Zoom bombing and the challenges of the security with Zoom. So we're trying to limit the broad scope distribution of invites to the webinar, but that doesn't apply to the recordings afterwards. Question from Cindy: do you anticipate this information being used and available in the future to stakeholders, including municipalities, in provincial processes related to energy or forestry development? I'm going to answer that in two ways. First, yes, definitely. I think that one of the challenges that we faced when we started into this project was, where is everybody at? And it seemed to be that we always started with, well, let's create the data and look around and see if somebody wants to use the data that we've created, as opposed to going the other direction. What is it you need? How are you using it? And like I said, our information was very, very cursory and certainly not statistically valid. But I would definitely say that that information would be useful. The second way I'd answer that is, that's not part of our project plan, is to go actively make that available, but it is part of our overall Moustakas mandate to make information available. It's free on the website. There's no registration required. All of our information we're increasingly making available without restriction, so it can be used however. Is there any way to broaden the study and make it truly representative of municipal staff province-wide? That's a great question. So we went back and forth on this. How do you make it more applicable more broadly? Because these issues that we're identifying are not specific to the Bow Basin, obviously. And one of the concerns that we had was, if you develop a strategy for one basin that is a province-wide issue and a province-wide need, then you're creating a whole new problem for yourself, a whole new dead end. We were balancing that with what's digestible, what can we chew off and actually deal with at this level. So that's why we've been trying to bring in representatives from other, again, whoever is leading the work in the different areas. So other WPACs or like the Oldman River Regional Services Commission. And we're hoping that in these next stages, we can start to connect with the other initiatives that are going on from the perspective of data gathering. Your question about making it more representative of municipal staff province-wide is an interesting one, because the vast majority of municipal staff across the province don't care about this, nor should they. This is not their mandate. They they are working on something else, and I think we are sometimes mistaken by stepping in and hoping that I'm sure everybody knows that this is super important. So that's why we've been working with municipalities to have them self-identify who would be the person within, or people within your municipalities. And obviously, City of Calgary has been very different from MD of Bighorn or whomever. So it's going to be an ongoing challenge, but it's also going to be one that we're going to have to keep within those two extremes of that sort of funnel. Should we be asking questions here rather than the Q&A function? Yes, it's the chat box. So within the chat box, you'll be able to see all of the other questions that are listed there. Municipalities only look for the quick answer to their current need. That I think that's probably true of all of us. Like I think one of the things that we're trying to recognize in any strategy that we put together is that any given person has 80 must-do things that are on their list, and 20 of them are on fire and time to do 10 of them. So we're constantly trying to put in a pervasive long-term need into a system that is really only geared to looking for the very shortest term. So it's definitely a challenge, I think, that we all face, but one that has to be integrated into the strategy. Don't assume that everybody's doing a long-term strategic view on this. Comment from Jay, need to be clear what kinds of questions can be answered with map wetlands data versus field collected and verified by authenticating professionals. Valuation cannot be assessed from maps. Delineations avoidance cannot be assessed from maps. Yeah, so getting into more information about this broader project. So we had Irina Creed and Sherry Claire come and present to the workshop, and they presented on exactly these kinds of things. Like what do you use data for, and how is that data related to the questions that you're trying to ask? And that doesn't necessarily line up, like Jay is indicating in his question here. Sometimes those are very different calculations. What we're trying to do is zero in on what is often an assumed base level piece where, yeah, once we get into that, we'll go and we'll do evaluation of all of the different wetlands from an ecosystem services perspective. And then they start down that road and find we don't even know where the wetlands are in our municipality. So that basic question of where is a wetland, what is a wetland, in the context of municipal decision making is remarkably unclear for a lot of municipalities. Struggling to keep up with questions here. Who does the merged wetland inventory? Is this publicly available? Good question. That's a Government of Alberta data set, and no, it's not publicly available. If you have a partnership with the Government of Alberta in a certain context, you might be able to access it through them for more of a kind of read-only perspective, or if you use a product that was created from that data set, you might have access to it as well. Or if you know somebody in government who can slip you a data set, I'm just kidding. Often like I said, it's the result of these partnerships where the data set is made available. The municipality where I live, Lac-La-Biche County, has a wetlands inventory and a riparian setback policy. How common is it that municipalities have these? What are some of the other mechanisms munis use to support wetlands and stewardship conservation? That is a big question, the second part of that in particular. But I would say that in my experience, and I'd be curious if anybody else who, like for example, Jay might speak to this as well. It's about depending on where you are, probably a little under half who have actually developed a wetlands policy, probably about a quarter who have developed a cross-municipality wetlands inventory that's specific to their municipality, and most have some sort of riparian setback policy. And what are some of the other mechanisms municipalities use to support wetlands? I don't have time to go through that, but Brian, if you wanted to contact me directly, I'd be more than happy to talk about some more of those things. It's also related to another project we're working on called the Municipal Eco Toolkit, which is we're going to be releasing soon, which will speak to a number of those tools and the applications for them. From Marina, GOA provided the Alberta Merged Wetland Data, Alberta Merged Wetland Inventory data set to ERWP under a data sharing agreement. That's a great example. So it's that information is usually available to an entity through a data sharing agreement, and all of the WPACs have a built-in data sharing agreement with the government of Alberta in these kinds of cases. So if you're working with your WPAC, you will have access to that data. Jay responding, Laklavish did a wetland inventory for lands that were under consideration for development in an atlas format. Okay. So if I understand that inventory, there are a number of municipalities who have done similar kinds of inventories, especially, for example, an urban municipality looking at an annexation might do an inventory prior to that, or even just after the annexation, for areas that are being considered for development. And I think this highlights one of the biggest challenges that we have, is that municipal tools aren't really well structured for proactive use. It's usually if somebody comes forward and applies for a subdivision, that triggers a number of things that a municipality can do. And up until the point that that application comes in, there are a limited number of things and limited resources to do anything around wetland inventories, wetland conservation, that sort of thing. And Jay follows up that the environmental reserve policy was to protect valuable wetlands within Red Deer Brook between Field Lake and the actual lake of Laklavish. Okay, thanks, Jay. I appreciate that follow-up information. Okay, we're coming up to our end here. I want to thank all of you for participating and all of the questions. That was a great discussion. And if you have, like I said, any thoughts about this, please, about this format, please let me know. As I mentioned, we're still trying to figure out the best way to do all of this. And last 2 points again, the more detailed reports are at this website that's on your screen. And if you want to email me at my email, guy@rockies.ca, I can send you a copy of the slides. So thanks very much, everybody.